Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Today, we welcome Shelli Pavone. She's a healthcare executive. Today's Kevin MD article is Why Retail Pharmacies Are the Future of Diverse Clinical Trials. Shelli, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right, let's start by briefly sharing your story and then telling us why you decided to share this article on Kevin MD.
So, I have been in healthcare for my entire career, over 20 years at this point. I started my career working for pharmaceutical and biotech companies. And then in about 2015, I transferred to healthcare startups. And in 2019, I founded my company, Enlightened. We connect healthcare professionals with market research firms, consulting firms, and pharma clients, and they launch studies and projects with our vetted network of healthcare professionals.
All right. Your article talks about how retail pharmacies are the future of diverse clinical trials. Tell us why you decided to write it. And then for those who didn't get a chance to read it, tell us about the article itself.
Yeah. So I wrote this article because, we're really at a moment where anything with the word diversity is being challenged. And in a way, it will have very far reaching consequences. And when it comes to clinical trials specifically, we really have not yet reached equality. And so chipping away at any progress we have made will have a significant impact on the people traditionally left out. And so I wanted to, again, address the issues with diversity in clinical trials, but I didn't want to be, doom and gloom about it. I think I've talked in many instances about the issues, why we struggle with diversity in clinical trials, and I've certainly talked about ways to fix it. But I wanted to address those gaps this time by looking at the way that we can use existing infrastructure. I've always talked about the infrastructure and the things that we need to build. But I think that this article addresses something that's already in place, and that's really looking at the retail pharmacy landscape and how we can utilize those locations to include more people in clinical trials, specifically people from diverse backgrounds. Something that was really interesting is in 2024, a research report found that more than 3 out of 4 Americans bought products from drugstores or pharmacy retailers. And I believe that the statistic is something like 98% of Americans are within 5 miles of a retail pharmacy. And so that demonstrates the accessibility of those businesses across populations and communities. And so why not utilize that infrastructure as a way to carry out decentralized clinical trials? And so that's really the basis of the article. And, of course, the article talks about, why diversity is so incredibly important in clinical trials. And, I think this is really an interesting possible solution.
All right. So let's talk about that last point about the importance of diversity in clinical trials. Give us an example or a sense of the scope of the issue. Any statistics that show how homogenous clinical trials are today, and then get to why diversity is important specifically as it relates to clinical trials.
Yeah, absolutely. Statistics on clinical trials today, even though there has been a lot of work done to address diversity in clinical trials, we're still seeing about 75% of clinical trial participants being white, and around 60% of those participants are also male. And so we're looking at oftentimes drugs being studied in populations where the disease may not be most prevalent. And then we are also missing out on important data and information about the people who need these therapies the most.
And what are some traditional methods investigators use to diversify clinical trials?
Well, some of the things that have been done in the new past have been really looking at the cultural competency and the education from the study. So investigators, do outreach programs in communities where they are looking to increase trial enrollment. Oftentimes there are large pushes to try to get people that have a higher prevalence of disease into the trials. And, the issue with that is that a lot of the trials are traditionally hosted out of academic medical centers, and the accessibility of those centers are certainly not as prevalent as the accessibility to retail pharmacies. So that is something that has failed us in a way in trying to bring more diverse participants into clinical trials.
All right. So now go into more detail in terms of your idea about using retail pharmacies
Mhm.
as a way to diversify the representation in these clinical trials. What would that look like?
Mhm. So, decentralized clinical trials are becoming more and more ubiquitous. There are, retail pharmacy companies that have attempted this, CVS and Walgreens, but really the whole point of it is having the retail pharmacies themselves be that clinical trial touch point. So, if a patient needs to be seen as a part of a clinical trial for, say, routine blood work or to pick up the medication that they're being administered, instead of driving to an academic medical center, they could just go to their local Walgreens and have their blood drawn or pick up that medication. A lot of the calls and the other touch points with clinicians that take place during these clinical trials can be done virtually. And so we're really limiting the amount of in-person engagements that have to be done. But when there is a necessity of an in-person engagement, somebody can travel to their local Walgreens instead of going, in some cases an hour or further to get that care. And I think that, that statistic about the amount of individuals who are within 5 miles of a retail pharmacy is really helpful in understanding how much more accessible these retail pharmacies would make clinical trials. I mean, there's a very big difference in saying how close are people to academic medical centers
Mhm.
versus, do you have a Walgreens or a CVS in your town?
So, what would that look like for patients? They would walk into a pharmacy and pick up a certain medication, and that would trigger a flag that there may be a clinical trial associated with that. So, from a patient standpoint, what would that look like?
From a patient standpoint, if there are clinical trials that are being done outside of a retail pharmacy, that pharmacy is typically going to advertise to those individuals within the community. But yes, that is important data that we get from those pharmacies, right? They have information about the medications that patients are on, and it may give them additional information about certain trials that patients may be eligible for. And so I'm sure that they can ask patients when they come to Walgreens if they're interested in understanding more about clinical trials, if they are interested in being contacted about clinical trials. And then they can go to those individuals who might be a fit and ask them if they're
Mhm.
willing or interested in participating. There is a lot of data that we have from pharmacies, and patients certainly can have a say in whether or not they'd like to be contacted. But I think it opens people's eyes to the possibility of participating in trials if they are given that education from a Walgreens or a CVS. Then they may have a little bit more understanding about what they have access to in their community.
And what would be an example of the scope of clinical trials that may be associated with retail pharmacies?
There are a lot of clinical trials that go on every year for simple things like flu season, right? We want to make sure that we're testing for the new flu vaccines or other kind of medications that may treat seasonal issues. And
Mhm.
so those are very often done out of a retail pharmacy. And so they're accessing a much larger patient population, and they might enroll patients in, a clinical trial for a flu vaccine or for, a decongestant medication or something along those lines.
So, in areas where this has been implemented, talk about some of the results and the effectiveness of this approach.
Mhm. So in this instance, we have seen an uptick in the enrollment of individuals from diverse backgrounds. So we're starting to see a shift in those statistics around like strictly white people enrolling in clinical trials versus people of color and women as well. And I think that, just generally people that wouldn't be reached in the marketing for clinical trials, or people that wouldn't have access to clinical trials, are considering clinical trials and participating in clinical trials. And this is still a new model, so we
Mhm.
don't have a ton of data yet, but it's definitely something that has shown that we can get more people enrolled in trials, and we're reaching populations that we wouldn't previously have reached.
So correct me if I'm wrong. When I walk into a CVS, I get the impression that the pharmacists are pretty busy and there's
Mhm.
staffing issues and whatnot. So do retail pharmacies have that capacity for the additional burden of potentially enrolling or drawing blood from patients for the purpose of clinical trials?
So typically those individuals that are overtaking the clinical trials are not generally going to be the staff pharmacists or the retail pharmacy staff. They're going to bring in specific study coordinators and PIs and sub-Is for these individual studies. So what that looks like is, a new study structure that is going to be carried out from these retail pharmacies. Many times the PI themselves may be remote and patients may just interact with them virtually. And then you will have a nurse or study coordinator staffed at the locations, and they will be there for the specific dates and times when individuals are coming in to get, a checkup as related to the clinical trial or a blood draw. So, the infrastructure is really set up separately from the general operations of a retail pharmacy.
So tell us, what do we have to look forward to? What's the penetration of this approach, and do you anticipate this becoming more widespread? What do we have to look forward to?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that I think is really interesting about this approach and some of the research that's been done is that when given the chance and the appropriate resources and access, people will not only choose to be included in clinical trials, but they will be active participants. And so when you look at that information, I think that we have a great opportunity by utilizing these locations to enroll a lot more people in clinical trials. And the more clinical trials that we can do, the more studies that we have robust enrollment in, the more new therapies we can bring to market. The other thing that I think is really interesting from this model is that there are a lot of clinicians and physicians who are being given the opportunity to be PIs and
Hmm.
sub-Is over clinical trials. And one of the things that we've looked at in the past for increasing the enrollment of diverse populations in clinical trials is making sure that the PIs or sub-Is, the clinical trial staff in general, are also from the same communities. And that helps go a long way when it comes to establishing trust. And so these decentralized clinical trials are giving more individuals an opportunity to gain experience as PIs and sub-Is as well. And so I think that this model in itself will increase the enrollment in trials. It will increase the number and types of trials that we're able to do. And it
Hmm.
will also increase the diverse populations that are enrolled in trials as well.
We're talking to Shelli Pavone. She's a healthcare executive, and today's Kevin MD article is Why Retail Pharmacies Are the Future of Diverse Clinical Trials. Shelli, let's end with some take home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think that one of the most important messages I can give here is that we still need to continue to advocate for equal access to healthcare, which includes, of course, clinical trials. This is something that we've seen movement on in the
Hmm.
past, and there are some better guidelines in place, but we need to keep our eye on the ball and recognize that a failure to include all voices in healthcare innovation not only perpetuates healthcare inequalities, but it casts a shadow on the potential of the medical advancements that we can have.
Shelli, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and insight, and thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.